Hey everyone, welcome to another session of A Day in the Life of a BA. This is the first one of 2026, so you're all very welcome today. I'm James, the president of IIBA Ireland, and I'll be your host today. At IIBA Ireland, our mission is to support professionals by sharing knowledge, common terminology, and practical insights into the work that us business analysts do across different industries or domains. And this series gives you a chance to hear directly from BA professionals about their typical day. So we're inviting a separate BA professional every month to share their personal journey, highlighting the approaches that they take, the technologies they rely on, the tasks that they do, the tools and techniques they use, or the challenges and successes that they have encountered within their industry. So whether you're considering a career in business analysis or already working alongside another BA, or just simply looking to deepen your understanding of the role, today's session is designed to give you that clarity, the confidence, and a shared language for working effectively with business analysts. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Omar, who will be talking about his day in the life in IT research and sharing practical insights from his own experience. Throughout the event, please feel free to turn on your cameras, and throughout the session, you're more than welcome to interact with other attendees using the chat. If you have any questions, you can either drop them into the chat or you can use the Q&A tab function. So without further ado, Omar, it's over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, James. Hello, everybody. Happy to be here today. Good evening if you are in our time zone, or if not, good morning, wherever you are. I'm sharing the screen. I just want to confirm that people is seeing it. Just prepare some slides to have our guided discussion. Hopefully you enjoy this. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks, James, and the Ireland chapter of IIBA. Really happy to be here. I think I have been very passionate about this series. Happy to be here. I think it's a really nice initiative, and happy to be contributing. My name Omar Portillo, and maybe just for a starter, just more tiny little breaking exercise. Just curious if whoever wants to participate on the chat, just looking interest about how your day doing, cat scale. I think if you are at evening, maybe number one is not a bad place to be. Right now, I'm on a 6. If anyone likes to contribute, by all means, do it on the chat. Just want to give you a very brief discussion overview of who I am. I am Omar, Mexican, now Irish by now. A fair amount of experience, 25 years here, in different roles. Roughly speaking, half of the time in industry, half of the time on academia, and among the credentials I have, because I'm a true believer of continuous improvement, is SEBAP, and I'm happy to say, I'm a bit kind of proud, I am the first person in Mexico to have been ever certified SEBAP. Looks like ages, or 15 years ago or so. And of course, you need to keep yourself the pace to keep improving yourself. Talking about, and maybe relevant for today's presentation, if you notice, roughly speaking, it's 50-50 industry and academia. There is kind of a breaking point somewhere in 2012. In this case, I decided to jump literally to Ireland to study my PhD. And the idea for this is something I noticed in my experience. Again, it's only my opinion, but sometimes business priorities matter, rules. Sometimes you need to take shortcuts. Sometimes you don't have enough time to address the root cause of issues. You need to keep the business moving. Sometimes during my General Electric time, I have the chance to get exposed for the first time. I think it was HP Labs. It was one of our vendors. I got curious about it, and I decided that I want to go to the root cause of things, try to spend enough time to fix that instead of just keeping the business going. And that's pretty much how I became here. Why? I thought it was inappropriate for this series of talks. In a nutshell, maybe I'm oversimplifying, but just for the sake of discussion, we can agree business AI do a lot of things. Pretty much in a nutshell, is in layman's terms to bridge the business needs with the solution. In this case, from a technical perspective, which is my background IT, we can support improving processes. In a nutshell, try to drive efficiency in whatever we are involved. And one interesting surprise when I came to Ireland, to be honest, I have this motivation, this curiosity, this desire to do a research. But as many things, again, if anyone wants to comment something in chat or give your 2 cents, I wasn't really certain what research means, how it was conducted. I just know what research produced from an industry perspective. In this case, a very nice surprise when I came here and started getting involved, learning what research actually means, the specifics. It's a lot of similarities that there exist between how BA I have used in the past in the industry and how the same challenges or similar challenges that exist in research. For instance, maybe the best example is research naturally intrinsically has some unclear scope. Normally, in its purest form, research means let's try to solve an unsolved problem within the scope that you are aiming. Of course, we'll go into a little bit more detail about it in a few slides. For the time being, just stick with me. Something that it was surprising to me because of this natural synergy between the fields is researchers often perform BA activities even if they are not aware of it, or they don't do it regardless of the role that they are doing. In a nutshell, this session, hopefully, the objective, if I can just summarize it in one line, hopefully you can get it from this talk, is to illustrate the natural synergy that, in my opinion, exists between these two fields. Not sure how many of you know this character. They come from an anime personal favorite of mine, Dragon Ball Z. The point here is that these are very two strong fighters, in this case, BA and research, but when they merge together, they get fused, they can be even stronger, in my opinion, in my experience. Just for the sake of everybody's awareness, to be on the same in the same channel, there are many variances of the life cycle of what research means. This is an illustrative one, at least, especially talking about the scoping, what typically BA needs to help with. I stick to IT. There may be variances. In my case, that's the expertise I have created for myself. And as you may guess, in this case, that's how we're going to be conducting the remaining of this talk. Just to give a little bit of a structure, we're going to be discussing how BA skills can be applied or naturally get applied to all the different steps that you can find in a typical research life cycle. Sorry, something important just to illustrate here, just for sake of presentation or illustration, this seems to be like a perfect iteration. In practice, probably not surprising for many people, like in any other fields. Sometimes this iteration is more iterative than it is illustrated here. You can be even conducting more than one phase in parallel just because it is needed by your project. In this case, it's just a matter of a research project. Another aspect that is important, just for the sake of understanding, hopefully to get a better picture, especially when I start talking about experiences or examples in the talk, there are many different sizes. There are very different animals talking about research projects. I try to simplify just to show this to the dimensional aspect, the size, in the amount of work, could be number of persons, could be the scope that we're going to be addressing, and also the complexity. In maybe it's easier to illustrate it in the lower spectrum. Maybe the smallest research project I have been able to supervise are master theses. They need to be research oriented, even though it's a very tiny little scope, and it could be sometimes challenging because time is extremely limited. A majority of my research theses are only 4 months in duration. So it's ready, set, go. If you get distracted, you can get already late in your project. You cannot even join too long because otherwise you are you are late. You can go something bigger, PhDs, normally 4 years, is still one person, and then there is a plethora of elements. At the top, you may have research portfolios. At least in Ireland, there is a lot. As far as I understand, the biggest research cohorts are called research centre. It's funded with a lot of millions. There is some fundings to support them. There are multi-organizationals, a lot of people, close to 100, just to make a ballpark number. So, and they last at least for 5 years, normally renew it. So you can see we can talk in a very, very different animals here. The curious thing is all of them follow similar processes, just the scale, just like in projects in other fields of the industry. Moving on, in this case, the first phase, the one we mentioned a moment ago, about this identification, ideation, and concept development. Again, just for the nature of how research is, the scope is normally vague, and even if it's less vague as you progress, normally it's not written in stone. The short version, in my opinion, that's part of the fun. One of the reasons I decided to continue in academia in particular is you have a lot of freedom to work in whatever research is of your interest. In my case, it's software engineering and friends. Recently, cybersecurity, just because it's so important in these days, but not being certain what you are going to get at the end is quite exciting. Despite that, it's also challenging. Again, talking about techniques and stuff, it's really important to manage stakeholders. Again, if you think for a moment, if the scope is, even in my experience, even in the best defined requirements, there could be ambiguity because the language is ambiguous, and that's a fact. So if in this case is naturally ambiguous, you can imagine how things can get conflicted, different interpretation, and so on and so forth, especially when I've had a chance to work in projects that are mixed academia and industry. Is a known fact from research that there is a natural tension just because these two generic cohorts of stakeholders have slightly different objectives. In a nutshell, academia tends to go up or appreciate more publications, peer review. We'll talk about them in a moment, but pretty much is papers, journals, conference, and so on and so forth. On the contrary, industry would love to have not even prototypes, if possible, running software, running solutions that can really address their businesses, or patents and that kind of things. So it's sometimes really tricky to manage those two elements. So you can start getting how business analysis skills can be useful. Just to give you an example about it, step number one, or maybe step number 0 would be a better definition of any PhD, including myself, is that you may come with an idea. Normally, when you propose a PhD, especially the funded ones, you have to have an idea, an abstract, what you are aiming to do. But the reality is, when you come, the first thing that you have to do is at least a few months. It depends on the scope, depends on the university and so on, but roughly speaking, between 6 and 12 months, you are just scoping out your project. And the remainder of the PhD, you continue scoping it out, just polishing piece by piece until you have generated enough context. In this case, publication is normally the main outcome that is measured. Even though it's a qualitative outcome, the quality of the publications also matter. And just to give you an idea, I think I was checking my notes of my PhD, and when I joined, in this case, UCD, where I studied it was revolving around software engineering for root cause analysis. Kind of what the kind of problems I found in the industry in my experience. At the end of the day, in my case, and it's roughly speaking, at least it's not atypical, sorry, roughly half of my PhD outcome was somehow related with these workload dependent issues. However, the other half was completely different. Is when I start seeing the bigger picture. At the end of the day, I think this is the name of my thesis. In a nutshell, trying to optimize the performance. I think there are two contributions in my thesis. One of those is, as I mentioned before, kind of related to what I did on the idea I came, but at the end of the day, 50% is completely different after I start publishing my ideas. Talking about what kind of skills as a BA are applied typically here, maybe not surprising that we have stakeholder identification. It's really important to take a look to that. One might think that it's just, if you are a PhD, for instance, it's a one-person job, and it's partially true. You are the one who does majority of work. That doesn't mean that the work will not be assessed by different perspectives. Could be your main supervisor in the university, will be the reviewers of the different papers, will be the reviewer or your final thesis, which are different, will be the people who review the process with the university, and will be also the industry. In my case, I have the chance, the opportunity to work with IBM in half of my PhD. Again, IBM had other interests, and that's one of the motivators, by the way, of focusing a little bit of my time in getting those patents up and running. Not surprisingly, requirements elicitation is important. You start with very similar to business requirements. The big picture, I think we'll see in one or two slides. Normally, we frame them like research questions. At the end of the day, just to give you an idea, and it's common in thesis, just talking about a medium-sized work, but it's true, again, if you go smaller or you go bigger, your thesis typically needs to be captured in one research question. That is, in my case, I spent almost 4.5 years doing my PhD. It has a X number of conference papers. I think I have these two major contributions, and somehow you need to capture it in a single research question that your 200-page thesis or whatever has to capture. This could be a very good idea of a business requirement, and then you have all the way down to the different levels. As you can imagine, feasibility and constraints is also important. Something that people sometimes doesn't realize is that the human part, as any other domain, the human aspect is important. This RPDP is very common, at least to the best of at least in Ireland, which is where I know the most about structured PhDs. I'm almost certain, with a fair amount of certainty, that Europe should be similar. We try to put a lot of emphasis in how the PhD student will grow as a person, what kind of skills he needs to learn. And in one of these elements, I will remember about is talking about your weaknesses, your opportunities, the risk that you see in your work. All of those, in my mind, come or can be better modeled, better shaped based on a BA mindset. For instance, in my case, even though I have always been a good enough programmer, that is the people who writes the programs, the software, the reality is in the last 5-7 years before coming here, I have been more on managerial positions. That is, Office was my best friend, not so much as the technical tools that I have done in my early stages in my professional life. So I have to, I was rusty on that. I have to work hard on that. And the first thing was to start with planning this RPDP, which was regularly evaluated. If I remember, it was roughly speaking at least one a year, if not on demand in case there is any issues or any major milestones, such as a middle term assessment that we have. Another interesting aspect, again, probably would be, at least for me, was another eye-opener when I was working my PhD, and it visualized how you need to measure feasibility or you measure constraints, is what kind of approach you're going to be using to evaluate your research. Just to give you an idea, my research has normally been focused on empirical evaluation. That's a fancy way of saying that my work needs to be tested in real life software, real life systems, and that means it involves real time calendar time. So if I try to plan my work and I realize I need to take, I don't know, 2 years to execute and validate an idea, that's pretty much something that will not be feasible. Normally, you need to be producing as a PhD, for instance, at least a paper, roughly speaking, 1.5 per year, talking as a ballpark number. On the contrary, some of my peers, I remember a lot of my peers work doing improving the traffic systems, trying to make a smarter decisions so that pretty much you can see which is the most efficient route to go from point A to B. Really cool traffic systems. But the reason I'm bringing this into the picture is, in their case, I learned by observation of them, they use simulations. And why does it matter? Simulations, they do not run in real time. They are simulated, and maybe they say an equivalent amount of time that maybe if I run it one after the other in real time, it may take 2 years, and maybe for them it may take 2 hours or maybe a couple of days. And again, both works may have the same likelihood to be accepted to the venues. So this illustrates how, if you know your approach, they can invest more time evaluating more criteria. Why? Because simulations are too many orders of magnitude faster than evaluations that involve real-time system. So after all this, the main output of this that your BA skills and help you is to have a clearer or clearish maybe. Again, there is always some shades of gray, but a clearish, agreed research problem. And maybe this is the distinction. You come with an idea, could be interesting, could be the one that motivated like myself to change industry to academia. However, you need at the end of the day to have a clear, rounded research problem. And something I can tell you, I have seen this challenge both as a student as well as supervisor with the students, PhD students I supervise. Is a very delicate balance. If you have a very big scope, it will not be accepted because it seems too risky to be done for a single person, even in 4 years. If you make it play it safe and you make it too small, they will tell you that that sounds like a master degree couple of years, very like research, not a PhD. So as in many other disciplines, in my opinion, this is half art and half science. Moving to the literature review, this is the second part. Literature review, and this is a general misconception, I agree, I have it when I came here, is that it's just reading papers. Yes, that's the kind of the action, but not the actually the rational. The reality is that it's a systematic and critical analysis, or should be a systematic and critical analysis of the current state of the art in your field or fields. And this is sometimes where the fun starts. The reality is sometimes doing literature review properly could be a challenge by itself. If you try to read all the papers, only academics, but in general publications that can exist for a particular field, maybe you take 4 years reading and you don't finish because more papers can get published and published. So there are actually techniques, actually methodologies to conduct a more efficient literature review. And what's important here, considering this systematic and critical analysis, each project, again, if you think about the different sizes I discussed at the beginning, regardless of the type, everybody needs to conduct at least one round of literature review. And I would like to stress the fact, at least in practice, I would imagine very likely will be more than one for each one of the iterations that we're doing. So maybe at the beginning, you are with the initial idea, so you focus on a particular domain, then you can go to another. The reality is that sometimes the bigger the bigger the idea, or more better said, when it's an intersection of more than one field, would be very, very hard to manage unless you put the literature review in order by itself. And this is when the skills can come into the picture. The first is gap analysis is important, is extremely important. The first thing you need to be looking for when you're doing literature review, you're not reading for the sake of reading, only you have a lot of free time to spare. You need to find what exists, understand what exists, and what is missing. Why? Thinking about you need to get an idea, and the idea, the research in its purest form, means that you need to solve a problem that has not been solved before. So it in general, it doesn't mean just repeat stuff that some other people do. You try to find your tiny little piece when it's going to be your own baby. Related to that, root cause analysis, the first step is to understand what is missing, yes. The next part is why that could be the case. For instance, in the past, machine learning, I think it has existed in the 70s. The only reason that has become such a big deal in these recent times is because now we have the computing capabilities for doing those. That's the kind of thing that you need to be assessing when you are doing research. And something that is common when you are trying to optimize or try to optimize tools and processes. In my experience, this may happen more often when you are doing more applied research or industry-oriented research, is doing modeling. At least I remember when I was starting to do my piece related to IBM, they were interested in improving. Well, we're interested in trying to build a expert system, and somehow after analyzing this tool that we were going to be building on top of it, I realized the problem was more like the workflow, the environment under which the system, the tool has been used, and this modeling allow to detect that maybe we're looking to the wrong piece of the puzzle. Any expert system would have come after the scope that I ended working in this part. So at the bottom line, what we want to do here is we need to find a research gap based on evidence. And maybe that's something really important, just to try to give you a couple of 2 extra cents. Regardless, whenever you are doing an output, normally publication or thesis, this is true also for patents, by the way. Now, to the best of my knowledge, you need to motivate your work. You need to show how it is different than the rest of the world. And a rule of thumb that I learned some time ago, and I find it quite useful, I usually use with my own supervisor students, is that if you are producing your publication, motivation is typically the introduction, a few paragraphs. You cannot have a paragraph without a citation, because these citations will, and probably more than one, these citations are those that will support your claims. Otherwise, will be just your personal opinion, and that's a big no on on research, regardless the type that you are managing. Let me see. I don't see a question on the chat. By all means, if anyone wants to contribute any questions, happy to do it. Talking about phase 3, now is when we move to methodology. Here is when we have to start defining the questions. Once we have our initial idea, once we have published it by finding the nice spot, the gap that we are going to be addressing, we need to put it in more formal terms. In this case, the formal terms, and maybe this is a good comparison or difference between industry, at least IT, and research. Just as in IT, the most common way to document requirements nowadays is user stories. In this case, normally we try to put it as research questions. And these research questions can be break down into research sub-questions, kind of similar idea. Those are the ones that you take a research question, and normally one of your publication or one of your outputs in general, if we want to generalize it, will be based on this research question. Very important, all this effort is to make sure that you can trace your requirements all the way down, all the way up. You have your big picture idea from your thesis or your project. Then you are in your current iteration, and needs to be linked just to make sure you are not wasting time in something that is not really needed. And as you can imagine, we need to be balancing feasibility. We keep this in the back of our heads. We have to be reassessing the constraints, such as the one I mentioned about evaluation. And then we have to publish later on. At the end of the day, in my mind, all this that I'm discussing here is nothing more that example of research engineering in action. And that's something quite interesting. That is, not surprisingly, which kind of BA skills are applied here. Certainly, we need to formalize requirements. As I mentioned, normally research questions, unlike industry, which is user stories. We need to define acceptance criteria for success. Another interesting, I would say, difference, in this case, acceptance criteria. Normally in research, what matters the most is to follow the right process. As long as you follow the right process, even a failure, that is, you have a hypothesis and the hypothesis proved incorrect, that's still success. Why? We have at least find that that hypothesis is wrong, is invalid. And again, even those kind of papers can get published. Typically, they are quite appreciated, so that we can avoid other researchers stop wasting potential time in solutions that haven't worked, at least with the set of assumptions that we have set. Certainly, you need to start thinking about how you're going to be evaluating your work, what kind of data, especially if you are doing something data analytics, very common nowadays with machine learning and friends, and what kind of tools, again, somehow related to the experimental evaluation. Do you need a prototype? Are you going to be using a simulator? Which one? For instance, to the best of my knowledge, that's not my expertise area, but no, as far as I know, Sumo continues to be kind of the de facto leader in that regards. So that is, if you test your traffic research using Sumo, plus I'm talking about data, there are a lot of maps of different cities that they have put so that you can simulate traffic in congested areas. Pretty much no one can say that you didn't use valid data and valid simulator, in this case, a tool, and maybe other dependencies that your system may have, such as the one I mentioned. My research normally, not always, but has involved calendar systems. That means you need to test a test environment composed maybe of very different software. And at last but not least, maybe I haven't mentioned in the past, maybe it's an obvious statement now that I'm mentioning about it. The reality is risk identification and mitigation, which is something that as a BA one can contribute as part maybe joint effort with project management techniques. It certainly is extremely important. At the end of the day, what's important here is kind of, again, trying to synthesize the output in a single line. Is a methodology, the one that you're going to be used to validate your idea, which is suitable for your problem. Not all methodologies are suitable. For instance, sometimes could be qualitative research or quantitative research, and each one of those have different methodologies that you can leverage. Needs to be traceable, again, needs to be aligned to what you are aiming to do and how you are trying to address the research. And maybe the most important part is that it must be defendable. In the simplest term, defendable when you try to publish is going to normally publications are peer reviewed. That means you need to convince whoever is reviewing your paper that is worth get published. Or in the bigger picture, you need to defend your work in a IIBA. At least that's something I remember. I always stress my students. The biggest questions when you defend your work could be a small, relatively small master thesis or a PhD thesis, is you have very good reasons, very good answers, sorry, to why you did things or why you did not things. No questions, answers such as because it's the first thing that I thought about it, or because my supervisor told me to do it. You can imagine are very good examples of weak solutions about it. What kind of sorry, what kind of skills? Certainly, it can allow you to formalize your requirements. You can define your acceptance criteria. Oh, sorry, no, this one. In this case, I think I already mentioned briefly about it. It's really, really tricky part on master thesis. In this case, something that in my experience has happened is master theses are very challenging. Even though it's a very small piece of research, it's extremely time constrained. In majority of my cases, it's only 4 months. Again, you cannot waste time. I spend a lot of time of my supervision helping them to shape this, the what and the how. And once they have achieved this milestone, it's still a lot of work. I always joke that it only needs to be done. I know it's a lot of work, but it gives a lot of peace of mind, not only for myself, but for the students, when at least they see where the finish line is. And that just come after you have spent a fair amount of time putting a lot of thought and effort in this part. If we move into the phase 4, is when after all that effort, the time comes to execute your experimental evaluation, your experiments, whatever your research is. And maybe it may ring some bells to some people in the industry. In the reality is it doesn't matter how much effort you put, even the best experiments, the best effort of the previous phases. The reality is that research may bring surprises to you. Experiments will evolve naturally. Assumptions might and typically break every now and then. It's just the nature of research, assuming you're doing good practices. If you did a poor job before, of course, it's going to be happening. And the reality is constraint changes. So all this we know it happens, but in my experience, if you try to put a little bit of order, leverage MBA skills, you cannot mitigate, eliminate chaos in the good sense. It's part of the changes that happen in research, but at least you can keep them under control. Something that maybe is not sure if how well known is, at least I know I didn't know before coming to the research world, is that again, research is very similar, such as industry, in the sense that we have a race against the clock. There are always deadlines to some degree, maybe not as tight, could be 3 months, 6 months, but at the end of the day, it's another source of adaptation that we need to keep in the radar. What kind of techniques, in my experience, are useful from the BA toolkit? Certainly, techniques that allow us to make priorities better. One must be tested first. Again, one thing that I personally do, I try to do my students or my research under my supervision to do is imagine that you have a clock on your head. So what happens if tomorrow you run out of time? Are you able to do a cut and have a coherent set of results? If yes, you are in a good path. If not, it's a matter of let's put some effort and try to prioritize. Just as you do a product backlog, for instance, it's the same idea that we have to do it. Try to decompose tasks. Again, piggybacking from agile jargon, certainly a difference in my opinion when I seen in both hats, industry and academia, there is maybe not surprisingly a higher number of spikes. That's just the nature of research, trying to mitigate the risk of the unknowns at the beginning of the project. We cannot mitigate them completely, but at least it's part of planning, part of the composing. Typically, I try to put together at least those, biggest risk, trying to address them first. And at the end of the day, it's always a tool in your toolkit to manage the change and do whatever scoping may be needed. In this case, for instance, it depends a lot. And again, it can come back to you depending which target venue you are aiming to do. They could be also very different animals. You may have a kind of the middle point, sorry, is the conferences. That's kind of the unit of work, let's say. Medium size it could be very demanding to get accepted. Good conferences are normally 30 or 20% acceptance, meaning it's more likely that you will get rejected than you will get accepted. The higher the conference, because there are rankings, sometimes it could be close to 10%. And vice versa, if you go to a smaller conference, if you go to workshops, the likelihood maybe switch and maybe you have 80% as acceptance. But again, you need to be balancing that. Depending on the field or fields, sometimes you need to be changing for a generic conference or a specialized. Those stakeholders, going back to the other square about stakeholder management, they will be looking for a different, for you to put emphasis in your outputs in a different field. It's not the same to sell it as networking, such as selling as software engineering, or in these times, everybody is looking for AI paper, for instance, majority of the conference. At the end of the day, what we're aiming is to have controlled experimentation instead of an ad hoc trial and error as any other process. You don't want to have an uncontrolled process. Just to give you my 2 cents here, at least what I always remember here, I have several rejections, if I remember correctly. It took me 6 or 7 tries to get my first paper accepted. It was a lot of effort there for many different reasons. But again, I had to work hard to find the right niche, the right amount of validation. Somehow, reviewers were not convinced my validation was strong enough. Even in work in progress papers, I think there was a point of bad luck, because work in paper are typically for novel ideas with little experiments. But again, you need to accept, to adapt. And at the end of the day, with a lot of automation, I was able to produce 70K different test cases, a lot of run parallel executions. I got my field accepted. And again, sometimes you enter into this vicious circle, and I was able to finish with 5 or 6, I don't remember. But again, it's tricky how you need to adapt to these situations. This one probably is not surprising for you, talking about business analysis. That analysis, when the time comes, certainly is really useful, the business analysis skills. Dangers on research, probably could be dangerous in general. I know in other domains, but sometimes you can just over or under interpret your results. It happens a lot, especially when you're early researcher, maybe with students and so on like that. I got data, now what? Is important. What I typically mention the students is that as long as you follow the process, you try to let the data talk. You are not sure if you're going to be telling a comedy book, action movie, or whatever. Let's hope it's not a horror movie if your results are sketchy and variable. But what's important is sometimes you can be just unconscious unconscious bias to give preference to positive results. Pretty much what may happen in other domains. But here again is when the BA mindset came into the picture. The aim is to conduct a systematic and appropriate analysis. And at the end of the day, research is everything about provisioning, providing an honest and holistic view of the work conducted. Is one way or the other. Again, not only the good results. Sometimes they could be more publicity, that's for sure. But in my case, I have a couple. I try always to put the negative perspective. Uh, a couple of papers, typically that kind of papers, get appreciated for the reviewers. Why? Because it's at least we're showing an idea that didn't work, and that can be at least as valuable as the ideas that worked, so that other people doesn't wait, don't waste time in the future. What kind of skills could be useful here? Certainly, yes, you need to validate against your predefined criteria. As not sure if I mentioned before, normally talking about criteria in the research world in a very simplistic, generic way is a set of metrics, and typically they are clustered in evaluation perspectives. For instance, I'm more a software engineer guy. That means that normally, because I'm checking systems in real time, normally the two perspectives that I cannot miss, if I miss them, pretty much I will have a rejection by default, and with good reason, is client side and server side metrics. If I cannot show at least how my research or how the systems that I'm evaluating perform in those two perspectives, pretty much is a waste of my time writing and a waste of the reviewer writing. So perspectives matter a lot. Of course, client side could mean many different things. As then it comes the metrics, whatever the metrics are. Each domain may have their preferences. Each venue sometimes could have preferences. That's why it's important to invest time finding the right venue to the job, to the work, sorry, and maybe the right level of quality. Normally, you may start with lower conferences just to try to get into this virtuous circle, and then naturally, the more the work matures, then you can jump into a higher ranking. For instance, in my case, at least the rule of thumb that my research group follow is at least two conferences, and then we close with a journal, as journals are normally for more mature work, and they are harder to get accepted in general, depending the journal, of course. We need to do a lot of analytic work, checking the assumptions. Thread of validity is something that typically all the paper has to do. It's a fancy way of saying which are your assumptions and which are the things that you didn't consider. Again, we have to put it to the work so they can better understand the scenarios, that the assumptions that make our work valid. At the end of the day, what we want is to have results that show the answer to the research question, or at least tell you why it was not answered. I think I already mentioned this. The important thing is to let the data talk, regardless the idea. At the end of the day, is not only quantitative. Quantitative is a good start. You need to show something, some number that back up your analysis, but certainly is appreciated what you can infer, what are the rule of the practitioner's ideas, or what does it mean a particular set of data. moving, we're almost finishing this iteration. In this case, dissemination. After all the hard work that we have done in the past, it's time to produce something tangible, even though there could be patents and other areas depending the type of project. Normally, as a rule of thumb, the natural outcome is publications, peer review. As I mentioned, I think before, it means someone else is reviewing. Could be depending on the venue, sometimes it's two, sometimes three. I think I have had papers who have 5 reviews, and they tell you in, out, or borderline. Sometimes it can be resubmitted. Journals typically is very, very unlikely that you get accepted at the first time. Journals can ask you for changes and continue indefinitely until you get accepted or rejected. I have cases of peers, not me, but peers that has taken 2 years, maybe 5 or 6 submissions because the reviewers always get ask something new. It's atypical. No, most of the time is 1 or 2 times. If after those something is missing significantly, normally you get rejected. If not, you get accepted. But the point here, from a business point of view, is that a paper is like the frosting of the cake that you have done your research, but is the thing that will be preserved in the repositories, published, and so on. Needs to be well structured and well written, and that's something that your skill as a BA can help. Plus, maybe it's obvious after all discussion about the reviewers and how they influence the success or not of your publication. Reviewers is another stakeholder that you need to learn how to manage, like the other ones. Maybe other than that, there is not much to tell here. Certainly, effective communication, the one that you can build based on your BA skills, could be extremely useful. You need to learn to tell a story depending on the audience. As I mentioned, each different domain is not the same to send your work to a generic conference, that a specialized conference in a particular niche topic. Your writing will have to adapt, needs to be tailored for sure to a different audience. And the idea, hopefully, with this outcome is that you will have papers accepted or more likely to be accepted. Again, there is a percentage of variability, and it's just the nature of research to have lower acceptance rate, as well as better presentations. Something extra that, again, once you graduate and you continue research, typically you do, or it's advised to be done, is try to participate on the other side as a reviewer. I have the chance to be in a couple of conferences, in a few journals, and in reality, it helps a lot. It just you switch hats, and it allows you to better appreciate what they are looking for. It's like the yin to the yang, and you can leverage that experience, try to make your papers stronger, so that it can be more bulletproof for future publications and future research reviewers. Sorry. With this, pretty much that's the end of the road. Not surprisingly, as other life cycles, normally what's expected is that you can reflect and adapt your roadmap. It's unlikely that research just only has one paper. Even a medium-sized project like a PhD typically has more than one. Research centers, by all means. Maybe the only exception I can think of is master theses. Normally you have one, and you want to go out, but certainly what as a researcher you have to do once you finish a research cycle, maybe you chill for a few for a few moments, and then you start thinking about the next iteration, whatever the iteration is. And again, sometimes this has to be paralyzed. If you have a rejection, sometimes what you have to do is you have to continue moving forward, because your idea needs to be continue mature. It's because there are constraints such as funding. And in parallel, somehow you have to parallelize your work to balance the workload, uh, context change, and so on, stuff like that, because you have to try to fix the things that fail on the rejection and try to resubmit. Hopefully you're lucky, you only have two. Sometimes it could be more than two. I think I already mentioned this a moment ago. As a rule of thumb, again, each university may have differences. At least this is a rule of thumb I see commonly in Ireland. Even though strictly speaking, you can finish a PhD without producing publications, the reality in practice is you need to have a certain number of publications so you can give confidence to the reviewers of the final thesis that your work has quality, and the more the better. At least in my research group, I think we usually have this rule of thumb of having 3 publications, 2 of them international conferences, 1 journal, plus whatever else can get into the into the pocket, a few workshops, a few national conferences, and so on and so forth. But it gives you confidence that you have a work that can be defensible. And then similar uh, mindset typically happens in other projects. You expect that any funding that you get uh, can be sustained with outputs, whatever outputs means, but normally they are publications. Here, probably relatively straightforward. You need, knowing how to do a good learn lessons retrospective is extremely useful. In particular, is something very important in my experience in research is good knowledge management. I think even if you check, if you're curious, at least when I was preparing for my VIVA, PhD VIVA, and I actually got that question asked is if you can go in time, travel in time, and talk to yourself when you were starting your degree, what advice would you give to yourself? And I remember, Crystal, as yesterday, the more time you can spend in automation, putting your ideas in order precisely to be able to evaluate your work better, the best. This is an example of knowledge management for sure. It's really important. And you need to reevaluate your roadmap for sure. At the end of the day, what you want to do here, ideally, is to have research continuity. Just to give an example, talking about regardless of the scope, we can go from the big research centers to all the way down to individual researchers. Research is pretty much managed and pretty much funded by competitive schemes. And the only way, in my opinion, to make it more sustainable to a certain degree, to keep the funding flowing, is to build on your previous work and experience. If you start from scratch every single time, you will never get traction, and it's extremely competitive, the fundings, as many other fields, I guess. We're in a very competitive war, I think. With this, I think we're almost closing. The last thing, just a personal comment from my side. Certainly, I think research, that's why I'm here, that's why I'm still here, is a very rewarding activity, but it's kind of tricky. You need to like that excitement, a little bit, a fair amount of uncertainty in the work. Certainly, BA skills, in my opinion, have been quite useful. Honestly speaking, far more than I expected when I switched from industry to research. Among my certifications, I think, in my opinion, SEBAP is the one that has me most helpful. So anyone who's curious about pursuing the SEBAP, in my opinion, is worth it. That's why I keep my renewing in the top of my list every three years to continue being a SEBAP. Closely, I have to admit, with PM combo, PMP and PMICP, but certainly SEBAP has helped me a lot. And again, not only research, in my role as academic, as lecturer, there are other non-research paths you may guess, and business analyst skills have also helped me in that. But certainly that's a story for another day. Who knows? Maybe a future series. I don't know, but it's completely different animal. Other than that, that would be all for my side. Hopefully you enjoy this. I'm more than happy to take any questions. I noticed people was a little bit quiet in the chat. Hopefully I didn't sleep you folks, but yes, happy to take any questions. Let me see where is to finish. I'll stop sharing maybe. Yeah. Happy to answer any questions or any comments. More than welcome. Welcome, yeah.
There is 2 questions in the Q&A tab. I'm not sure if you can see that, Omar.
Oh, I think Q&A. I in the chat. Where is the Q&A? Sorry. Oh
There's
yeah,
a little.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
Thanks. Which mention skill you think the most essential thing in my daily work? That's a very good question. I think scoping, being able to decompose tasks and give priority is certainly, in my opinion, the most important one. Maybe a particular challenge now that I'm lecturer is that I am not a 100% time researcher. I am a part-time researcher, whatever that is. The time flows. in academics in academic semester and when I'm not in academic semester. So time is extremely valuable. And the only way I found to be productive in research is to be able to decompose the scope into as unitary tasks as possible. So that decomposing and making the right priorities has proven extremely useful, in my opinion, in my day to day. I hope I this. Oh yeah, I hope I answered this one. What challenge other than AI related do you think will separate great BAs from mediocre ones in the next 5 years? Jose, I think that's a really, really good question. Certainly, maybe I'm just too biased when Gen AI. Certainly, it has been a disrupting in education, like any other domain. Any mediocre from, I think, uh, again, the second from the top of my head, without giving too much thought, I would imagine that you need to become a little bit more disciplinary in terms of getting at least a little bit of fundamentals of cybersecurity. I think in these days, it's becoming really, really scary. The risk that we have has become everybody's job to be involved in cybersecurity. And I think with the relevance in security, a BA needs to be up to the challenge, and a little bit of awareness, fundamentals of that would become extremely important. Just to give you an idea, I typically, one thing is try to keep up with my recertification and so on. The other thing is try to keep up with the pace of the work, whatever it is. The last year or so, I've been focusing myself, my personal growth in security, precisely because of the relevance of the domain. Uh, I would say that that's it. If you can just try to have at least awareness, basic fundamentals, there are a lot of certifications. I think I I forgot the name. I can look and put it in the chat. I think it's ICC2s. Yeah, yeah, International Security something, ISC. I think that one has a very, very good CC certification. You can see in my LinkedIn, the CC, I forgot the name, but that one gives you a very good awareness of the domain. And I think I'm currently studying CompTIA Security Plus. That's also a very high level perspective. Believe me, I think security will make a big difference. Yeah. Yeah. I think yes, Jose, I think you're right. Certainly, technology has become a big driver. Now you have remember me. Security, I think, in my mind, is the most important field. In second place, I think BAs needs to become a little bit aware of the fundamentals of technology. I think because pretty much majority of systems or majority of projects, at least enterprise level, are related to cloud. So at least you need to have a fair amount of understanding of the fundamentals of the cloud and friends, such as the technologies you're saying, blockchains and cryptography, as example, security. Blockchain certainly is another one. Quantum computing, I would put it maybe just in a third place. I know, we know it's coming, but it's not coming at least yet. That's the only reason I'm putting other domains such as security on top. But now you have made me remember that at least clouding, computing, and friends, it's also important at least to know that be able to have a informed discussion with other stakeholders, such as IT department, because everything these days is cloud. Yeah, I think that's the only one. The last one, sorry.
Yeah, I think we've reached well, we're nearly at the top of the
Yeah,
hour, but
yes,
thanks so
30
much,
seconds or
Omar.
so.
The countdown's on, but thanks so much, Omar, for taking the time to present for IIBA Ireland and for sharing your expertise. It's really interesting to see how the BA related skills can relate to IT research, and especially of all the work that you've done. So it's really impressive. So thanks so much for taking your time, and thanks so much for everyone for taking the time to join today. We will be having another day in the life of a BA, so keep an eye on our LinkedIn profile and also on my LinkedIn profile. If you want to connect with Omar, please feel free. And until then, we will leave it there. We'll have a lovely evening and talk to you later.
Yep.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
James. Thanks,
Right.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.